Welcome, Dr. Epiker, and what we're going to discuss in this lecture is monsters of the Antipodes, noble savages, savage devils, the Field Museum of Chicago, and how bodies themselves change in America. We're going to talk about where cultural anthropology comes from. We're going to start with ancient travelogues, Victorian scholars, and end with the man himself, Franz Boas. We're going to follow that outline right up above my head, and we're going to start in ancient Greece. We're going to start with travelogues. Now, travelogues are a type of literature. They were once extremely popular. And travelogues are stories of an individual's travels. It details where they went, who they saw, who they met, what they did there. The very first travelogues come out of ancient Greece. And in fact, Herodotus's journeys across the Eastern Mediterranean and his journeys to ancient Egypt were themselves a type of travelogue. And travelogues have been some of the most influential books ever written, like Marco Polo's Il Milione, where he travels from Venice all the way to the court of Kublai Khan in China, or Amerigo Vespucci's Il Lettera, about his journeys up and down the coast of South America. In fact, Amerigo Vespucci's travelogue is so popular, it names America. America is named after Amerigo Vespucci. Now, one of the things that characterize these travelogues, they don't have to be accurate. They don't have to be, realistic, but they do have to be interesting. And to make the travelogues interesting, a lot of the writers of travelogues were not above putting monsters in them. The monsters on the other side of the world, the monsters of the Antipodes. They would travel down into the depths of Central Africa, and where they would encounter a kingdom of incredibly religious people that had dogs for heads. The kingdom of Prester John, somewhere in Central Africa, this mythic land. They would travel across the Mediterranean, across the corners of the world, and find people that only had one huge leg, or people that had no heads, or they had their faces in the center of their chests. And I guess bras would be like sunglasses. I don't know. Anyway, there would be people with only one eye, or, there's more dog-headed people up ahead. These are the monsters of the Antipodes, the strange and exotic and bizarre inhabitants of the far corners of the earth. And that's what they would find. And they weren't just limited to people with their faces in their chests, or incredibly religious, like dog-headed people in Africa. Often the monsters of the Antipodes would simply describe how utterly bizarre and weird actual people were in other parts of the world. Let's go to Amerigo Vespucci himself. Amerigo Vespucci in the early 16th century sails up and down the coast of what is today South America. And he writes these incredible stories of the people he finds there. He writes stories where the people are essentially monsters of the Antipodes. And here's a quote by Vespucci himself. "We found the region inhabited by a race of people that were entirely naked, both men and women. They were a warlike race and extremely cruel. The most astonishing thing in all of their wars and cruelty was that we could not find any reason for them. They made wars against each other, although they had neither kings, kingdoms, nor property of any kind, without any apparent desire to plunder and without any lust for power, which always seemed to me to be the moving causes of war and anarchy." In other words, the people that Amerigo Vespucci encounters are just these they're these savage devils. They're just savage and warlike, and they're fighting each other and they're eating each other. He mentions cannibals a whole lot. And he uses snakes. I don't know if I want to tell that story. Snakes used as marital aids. Let's just leave it at that. But these are not really people that Vespucci is talking about. These are caricatures of people that he encountered in South America, or people that were just so different from him. He couldn't interpret them as anything other than monstrous and wicked and utterly weird and bizarre and exotic. And it also made for a really good book. And that's one of the things he wanted to do, is sell copies of his books. But it should be noted that these monsters of the Antipodes, are in fact still with us. This is to some extent how we tend to imagine other people, how we imagine people living in distant corners of South America or in tiny forgotten parts of Africa or Asia. We tend to view them as strange and exotic, fantastic and barbarous, and we tend to kind of slot them into one of two different categories as kind of savage devils or noble savages. But what the things you need to remember about the monsters of the Antipodes is that they are, in fact, not real. There are no people with ears so big they can use them as purses. There are no people with faces in their chests. There are no people with one eye in the middle of their forehead. Monsters of the Antipodes do not exist. All people, all Homo sapiens are the same, and you shouldn't characterize them one way or another. And like I said before, this tends to fit in the characterization of sort of these exotic peoples or these distant peoples tends to fit in one of two different types of categories. Savage devils, that's savage devils, and noble savages. Now, savage devils are easy. Those are savage devils right there. It's just when other people are viewed as inherently monstrous and cruel and warlike, and they're just into just murder and war and death, and there's something wrong with these people. They're savages. They're barbarous and strange and exotic. Those people don't really exist. Now, they inhabit their own subjective reality. This is true. But savage devils don't really exist any more than their opposite counterpart, the noble savages. The noble savage views people in the exotic parts of the world, people in the distant parts of the world, as inherently better, gifted. They're somehow uncontaminated by modern society, uncontaminated by living in cities and living in the modern industrial world. And it basically consists of, their entire people consist of a very good looking Graham Greene looking off into the middle distance while a single tear rolls down his cheek. They don't exist. Noble savages, savage devils, none of these people exist. And I'm going to make fun of Dances with Wolves. It's not a bad movie. It's not a bad movie in and of itself. Its portrayal of Native Americans is ridiculous. It basically portrays Native Americans as these deep, like soulful people that are uncontaminated by nature. Those are not people. All right, that's not any more accurate than portraying Native Americans as savage devils. Neither of these people exist. They're just people. All right. They do have a very different culture, and their culture gives them a unique perspective on the world, and they operate as to the dictates of their own subjective reality. But neither characterizing non-Western people, characterizing people as savage devils or noble savages, obscures what they actually are, which is they're just people. All right, and it definitely gets in the way of anthropology. It definitely gets in the way of actually studying these people and studying the worlds they create, and therefore learning about ourselves. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with travelogues. Travelogues still continue to be a literary genre that continues to this day, and some of these travelogues are really quite good. Assassination Vacation is really actually fun. She goes to different sites of different like assassinations, and P.J. O'Rourke's Holidays in Hell is just absolutely hilarious. And I'm a huge fan of Anthony Bourdain, before he passed. But here's the thing. Travelogues can be fun. They can be entertaining. They can be great literature. But travelogues are not anthropology. All right? Travelogues are primarily about the traveler. A travelogue is about the journey of the traveler as he goes from A to B to C. Travelogues are not about the people. They're not about what is encountered along the way. And they're definitely not studying the people that are encountered in the course of these journeys. It's not really a journey, it's a study. Anthropology, as per Franz Boas, who we'll meet in just a tick, anthropology tries to understand the cultural and social variation present in the world and to understand how such variation developed. By looking at distant cultures, we learn about the human condition. We learn something about our own cultural practices. But there is really bad anthropology out there. Really bad anthropology tends to skirt dangerously close to being travelogues, all right? And my Lord, I've read some anthropological monologues that everyone praises, and I read it and go, this is a travelogue. This is all about the anthropologist, and I really don't care about the anthropologist. And really, really bad anthropology does not portray the people it discusses as people. It portrays them as some sort of mythic, noble savage. It portrays them as the better of people of the modern world, uncontaminated by the modern world, looking off soulfully into the middle distance while a single tear rolls down their cheek. That's not accurate. That's really bad anthropology. But before we start talking about noble savages, before we start talking about travelogues, let's actually talk about what travelogues turned into. They turned into a kind of Victorian anthropology. Now we're going to start in the 19th century. And there is Mr. 19th Century right there. That's Taylor, if I remember correctly. Victorian anthropologists of the 19th century often used travelogues, and they used these accounts of explorers and colonial officials as those guys kind of went out across the world, conquering the world for various European powers. And what they did is they used these travelogues, they used these accounts from explorers or colonial officials to build these arguments for the development of the human race. And these are very armchair anthropologists. They basically would sit in their study, drinking their tea and eating their cucumber sandwiches and sort of theorizing about the nature of the human condition. And these armchair anthropologists had these really, really heated debates about what the human condition was, about the laws that might govern human culture. But the problem is, none of these guys actually wanted to leave their very comfortable salons. They wanted to sit at home and drink their tea and eat their cucumber sandwiches and go to the pub on the weekend. They didn't actually want to go out and study people. They just wanted to sit at home. But the problem is that none of their arguments could actually be resolved by staying at home. And so they reached this impasse. It was a very, very stagnant field of study. And their argument is that they wanted to talk about how culture progresses through time. The argument was, this is the argument dreamed up by the Victorians. The argument was that culture progresses in a series of stages through time, that all aspects of culture progress together, and all people kind of go through similar stages of cultural evolution in a ladder of social, technological, moral, and cultural progress. That you might start with primitive and childlike savages, primitive and childlike Australian Aborigines, but eventually they will develop into cultured Iron Age Greeks and Romans. But of course, eventually those guys evolve, their culture evolves into the Industrial Age at the height and at the top of the cultural evolutionary progress, which is, of course, the Victorian gentleman. And by the way, that should already throw up a red flag. Like, if you come up with an evolutionary sequence and you place yourself at the apex of evolution, that should be a big warning flag right there. But this is what these Victorians were arguing about. They were arguing about the progress of cultural evolution through time. And they basically viewed the human past and the human present as kind of this ladder, like a ladder. By definition, it meant that these guys were evolutionists. They're essentially not concerned about studying individual cultures. They just want to study how cultures progress through time, how we start from a primitive past and end up in a sophisticated, evolved present. So everything they did is comparative analysis. They're looking at all the Stone Age tools. They're looking at all the tools made out of stone. They're looking at all the tools made out of bone. Then they're looking at all the tools made out of bronze and copper. And then they're looking at everything made out of iron, and then they're looking at everything made out of, of the Industrial Age. And this fit very well with kind of Victorian values of social and technological progress, and how Victorians saw it as their duty to conquer large parts of the world and to conquer the backwards portions of the world and uplift these people from their relatively primitive state. The idea was that technologically simple societies like Australian Aborigines that you see right up above me, that these people represent survivals of a past age, that they represent people that have been sort of stuck from a primitive era of human existence. And the Australian Aborigines are simply living fossils from primitive man. All right. I'm now going to drop some heavy truth on you. Are you ready? You ready for it? It's heavy, heavy truth. Nod when you tell me, nod when you're ready and I'll see it. Okay, here we go. There is no such thing as cultural progress. We are not morally progressing towards anything. Progress involves like steps taken and it assumes an endpoint. No, there is no progress. We're not going anywhere. We're not necessarily better people than people were 100 or 500 years ago. And often these Victorian views led to this very crude sort of pseudo-scientific racism, either in the form of social Darwinism, either in the form of eugenics. Victorian anthropology lended itself to heavily discriminatory views in which these backwards people, these primitive peoples, needed to be liberated from their primitive culture. They needed to break the chain of culture that sort of made these people backwards and primitives and uplift them into Victorian society. This is like why you had like really awful things like children being taken away from their parents and educated in like schools so they would not learn the language of their parents. It's absolutely horrible. And if the people couldn't be uplifted, then they simply had to be confined to reservations, swept out of the way to make way for more advanced and cultured Europeans. It's just really sad that we have to wipe out these natives. They're primitive and backwards, and they weren't making good use of the land. And that's just the way progress works. That's just the way evolution works. The more evolved species pushes the less evolved species aside. That's what they thought. Now, there's a scholar called Stephen J. Gould. That's him right up above me. And he was quite famous in his day. He's in a couple episodes of The Simpsons. But Stephen J. Gould he's a very famous biologist, and he wrote a book about this pseudo-scientific racism, and it's an absolutely fantastic book called The Mismeasure of Man. And he studies the way in which science was twisted and perverted to fit the pseudo-scientific racism of its day, and how all the peoples of the world got ranked, like a series of ranks between the people on top, the people in the middle, and the people at the very bottom, the hopelessly backward, racially inferior people of the day. And he tracks it. It's an absolutely fascinating read if you're interested in the history of science and how science can ultimately get things wrong, and how you have things like the consensus of the day. Look at that image on the left. Good Lord. In 1870, that was the consensus of the day. The science is settled, But science got it wrong. There is no cultural evolution. There is no cultural progress. We're not going anywhere. There is no apex of civilization. All right. We're just people, and we're all just trying to do our best, in this kind of crazy world, this world that we don't even perceive correctly. All right. We're not going anywhere. There is no progress. But it doesn't matter. At any rate, like World War I comes along and puts paid to any concept of European morality, puts a dramatic exclamation point on this sort of ridiculous ideas of progress. It's absolutely horrifying. Europeans tore at each other and killed each other with such relentless savagery that they shocked everyone else in the world. As a matter of fact, in France had a lot of colonies in Africa. And France actually runs out of men at one point to throw into the meat grinder of the First World War. So they go down to Africa, specifically their colony of Senegal, and they recruit all of these African troops, bring them to France, and then proceed to have them, go fight the Germans. And one of the things that were noted about the African soldiers is that the French officers grew very, very angry at these African soldiers because they wouldn't shoot retreating Germans in the back. They viewed it as uncivilized. That the Germans would attack, the Germans would be pushed back, and the Germans would run back to their lines. And then all of the African troops, all of the Senegalese troops would just quit shooting. And the French officers were like, you have to keep shooting. And the African troops, these primitive savages, would refuse to shoot fleeing men in the back because they viewed that as something horrific, and uncivilized. So the African savages ended up being kinder and more civilized than the enlightened European and French soldiers of their day. Of course, absolute nonsense. There's no such thing as progress. At any rate, there is a lonely voice calling out against this, and his voice becomes louder and more listened to as time goes by, and especially after the First World War. But even before the start of that, there is an intellectual movement against these 19th century evolutionist thoughts, especially with its innate ethnocentrism and racism. And that guy is that fellow right there, and his name is Franz Boas. You know it's important because it's in all caps, and I've been talking about him for like 3 lectures. This movement against 19th century evolutionism is led by a German-born American anthropologist named Franz Boas. Franz Boas will basically go on to be the person who founds the Americanist school of anthropology, and he becomes one of the central figures that demolishes this Victorian perspective on other cultures. And young Franz Boas, there he is, young Franz Boas in the corner. Now, Franz Boas himself, 1858 to 1942, was born in the city of Minden in pre-unification Germany. I don't know how well you know your European history, but until 1872, Germany was not a unified state. It was a bunch of little countries. And he received his doctorate in 1886 in geography. And what he did in geography is he studied the people of the Eskimo, what we now call the Inuit people of Baffin Island in northeastern Canada. And when he's talking about the people of Baffin Island, and when he's talking about the Inuit people of northeastern Canada, he's introducing a new definition for the word culture. Prior to Franz Boas, culture just meant whether you were cultured or not. If you listen to jazz, you are uncultured. It is the 19th century. Well, it's pre-jazz. If you listen to sort of regular music hall music, you are uncultured. If you listen to like Bach and like Mozart, then you are cultured. You know, if you read, penny dreadful novels, you are uncultured. If you sit and you read like ancient Greece and ancient Latin books, you are cultured. That's how the English viewed the word culture, as whether on a scale of education and status within society. This is not how Franz Boas defined it. Franz Boas imported the German definition of culture, which is a shared body of knowledge collectively agreed on by a group of people. In other words, it is Franz Boas who imports this German idea of culture into the English language. And he applies this concept to the Inuit of northeastern Canada. The idea that they possess a common set of belief systems, even though they are politically disunified. He introduces this concept of culture, and it gains immediate acceptance. This is a really powerful idea. And he begins to gain some set of renown for himself. And in 1893, he is invited to run the Field Museum of Chicago. He becomes the first director of the Field Museum of Chicago, or rather what would become the Field Museum of Chicago, during the famed 1893 Columbian World Exposition. And that's where these photographs are taken from. He's there, and they're asking him about Inuit ceremonies. And he starts describing the movement of the paddling of canoes. He's describing the hunting. He's describing the birthing techniques of Inuit shaman, where the shaman has themselves reborn through the vulva of a killer whale. That's supposedly, I believe, what he's doing right up above my head. At any rate, he's describing this, and the people don't really get it. So without even thinking about it, Franz Boas strips down to his underpants and simply starts reenacting all of these Inuit rituals in 1893, which is where the absolutely greatest series of photographs ever taken come from. This is the founder of Americanist anthropology. This is absolutely brilliant man. So he becomes the director of the Field Museum of Chicago, and immediately he gets into a massive amount of trouble, because the directors of the Columbian World Exposition, they go in, they want to see all of these artifacts and all of this stuff from around the world, and they walk in and they're like, the theme of our world exposition is progress from the primitive past to the modern present. And Franz Boas is like, that idea is stupid. We're not going to do any of that. He arranges the Field Museum to look like taking each group of people and trying to understand them in terms of their own culture. He has a series of displays about the Inuit. He has a series of displays about Native Americans. He has a series of displays about various parts of Africa. He doesn't arrange them in any technological sequence. He doesn't arrange them like they are stages in cultural progress. The director of the Columbian World Exposition, they're absolutely apoplectic. They're like the entire theme of our huge world exposition. The entire world is coming to Chicago. And this is organized around themes of concepts of progress and development. So Franz Boas says, I'm not going to do any of that. And they say, Dr. Boas, I understand you made a big splash in Germany. I understand you're kind of a famous German scientist. I understand you did a lot in northeastern Canada, but arrange things the way we want or we're going to fire you. And Franz Boas says, no, that's scientifically inaccurate. I'm not going to do it. They fire him. So the founder of Americanist anthropology gets fired from his first job, running the Field Museum in Chicago. And he eventually ends up at Columbia University in New York City, where he founds the first school of Americanist anthropology. And while he's there, he institutes a series of major changes in how you study and analyze culture. And especially in the 1920s and into the 1930s, he has a completely revolutionary way to study culture. And this becomes known as the Boazian Method. And there's Franz Boas right up above me. He's no armchair anthropologist. If you're going to go study the Inuit of northeastern Canada, you dress up like that. You go to the people of northeastern Canada and you live with them and you study. If you're going to study the Kwaikutl of the Pacific Northwest, you go to the Pacific Northwest and you study those people. So he makes 4 major changes as to how people are going to study culture. 1, direct field observation by trained specialists. You're not going to sit like a Victorian scholar, no Victorian musing in your comfortable salon, sipping your tea and eating your cucumber sandwiches. If you're going to study people, anthropologists must go into the field. They must learn the language of the people they study. They must directly observe how people are actually interacting within their social environment. 2, cultures can only be understood in terms of themselves, not as part of any sort of grand evolutionary schematic, because those things don't exist. If you really want to study a people, you have to look at how the people handle themselves. The Inuit can only be understood in terms of the Inuit. The Kwaikutl can only be studied in terms of the Kwaikutl. And the experts on Inuit culture, or the experts on Kwaikutl culture, are the Inuit and the Kwaikutl themselves. This is point 3. Every individual of a culture is an expert in their own culture, and the anthropologist acts as a student. You learn from these experts. So, you're Franz Boas. You want to go to northeastern Canada. You are the student. You go to northeastern Canada. You learn to speak Inuit. You sit at the feet of the Inuit people and you say, tell me about your culture. And then they tell you about their culture. They are the teacher. You are the student. And once you've learned about their culture from the experts of their culture, you move on to point 4. The anthropologist then studies the culture in great detail. You become an expert on that culture, and then you're able to come back to the United States or to Europe or to wherever, and then you offer interpretations to the public about the people you've learned. You present their culture to your own people, to your country of origin, and offer interpretations as to why they act the way they do. And to answer this question, and this is the question that Franz Boas poses, and the question that he said, only anthropology can answer this question. And there it is. This is the most important question you're going to hear in this entire course. So write it down. And the question is, why are the tribes and nations of the world different? And how have the present differences developed? And this is exactly what Franz Boas spends the next 50 years doing? Studying the Kwaikutl, studying the Eskimo, writing this down in ethnographies of the people he studies, presenting different interpretations in an attempt to answer that question. Why are the tribes and the nations of the world different? And how have the present differences developed? And this is exactly what Franz Boas does. This becomes known as the Boazian Method. You go out to another culture. You learn their language. You become a student, and they are the experts. They teach you that culture. Then you take what you've learned back to your own people and then explain that culture to them and offer interpretations. That is the Boazian Method. And this is what Boas does. One studies a culture, you learn from the teachers of the culture, then you describe the culture, often in exhaustive detail, and then you offer an interpretation of that culture. Now, the interpretation is generally going to be based off of the philosophical or psychological models that were very popular back in the 20s and 30s. And that's how people understood how human thought was supposed to work. And this is what Franz Boas proceeds to do. And Franz Boas leaves a long, thick pile of books where he does this. He learns from the people. He studies the people, and then he offers interpretations of those people back to the country of origin. Through discussion with and by living among native peoples, anthropologists came to the realization that non-Western peoples are not primitive or backwards, and that through the application of scientific techniques, the heritable nature of behaviors can actually be dismissed. You don't inherit behaviors. You learn behaviors through culture. Boas argued strongly against the use of anthropology to serve the imperialist designs of Western powers, for use of the scientific method in the study of the human species, and for active field research on the part of anthropologists. No more armchair anthropology. If you want to learn about the Kwaikutl and about what the Kwaikutl do around Vancouver Bay, you got to go there. You got to learn how to carry a totem of an orca on your back, like Franz Boas is doing right here. This knowledge, this understanding of different people is then used to improve the society you came from. Boas forcefully argued that non-Western cultures are not products of primitive thinking or intellectually deficient individuals. There is no such thing as primitive man, even though he wrote a book called The Mind of Primitive Man. Don't worry about that. There is no such thing as primitive cultures. There is no such thing as primitive man. And he again takes these concepts and applies them to American culture, focusing on the problems of race in particular, writing again and again on how race is not a determining factor in behavior or culture. And probably his most influential book is a book he didn't write about the Kwaikutl or about the Inuit of northeastern Canada. Franz Boas's most influential book, he wrote in 1911, actually, and it's called Changes in Bodily Form of Descendants of Immigrants. And it is the application of these anthropological concepts to recent immigrants to the United States. Now, Changes in Bodily Form of Descendants of Immigrants, I'm going to describe to you the book because even though you've probably never heard of this book published in 1911, I can guarantee you that the concepts that Boas invents for this book have become so accepted that, I'm going to explain the book to you and you're going to go, yeah, of course, that makes perfect sense. Well, nobody thought that before Franz Boas wrote this book in 1911. His argument is so powerful and his concepts are so potent that, the central argument of Changes of Bodily Form of Descendants of Immigrants has become standard knowledge. Everyone thinks this now. And, that's how you change the world. That's how Franz Boas changed the world. So the book started in 1908. It started as a study commissioned by the United States Immigration Commission. And the fear was, in 1908, you have the culmination of large-scale immigration from different parts of Europe. particularly Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. So you're getting lots of Italians, lots of Sicilians, lots of people from Poland, lots of people from Greece, lots of people, lots of Russians are coming over. And in particular, a lot of Jewish immigrants are coming from Eastern Europe. And these people were generally quite short, okay? They were not very tall people. So the fear was, this is going to sound ridiculous, but you have to bear with me. The fear was that all of these short people, these short-statured immigrants, were arriving in the United States. They're going to blend into American society, and they're going to blend in with the existing tall Americans. And because you've got tall Americans, and they're going to have children with short immigrants, that the overall height of the American people are going to drop. That's the fear, okay? That a large influx of short people are going to make the average stature in America short. It's going to make Americans shorter. And Franz Boas studies this. And he spends about 3 years on Ellis Island in New York. And if you have people that came through Ellis Island between like 1908 and 1911, chances are pretty good that they had to get examined by Franz Boas for a little bit. He was measuring their height, measuring the size of their heads, measuring their arm length, asking them questions. But Franz Boas didn't just measure immigrants. What he proceeded to do was to go out in New York City and study second-generation immigrants, and then study third-generation immigrants, because he wants to see what happens to bodily form, specifically stature, over successive generations. And this is the conclusion reached by Franz Boas in 1911. That the short stature of immigrants didn't inherently come from any sort of inherent or intrinsic value that they had. The reason that these immigrants were so short is because that they were very, very poor in the old country. They came from very impoverished backgrounds. They didn't receive proper nutrition when they were young. And so they grow up in the old country stunted and impoverished. In fact, that's why they're immigrants. If they were well off and well fed in the old country, they wouldn't have immigrated. So you have all of these nutritionally stunted immigrants coming over because they're poor, because they're wretched. And they come to the United States. But in the United States, they gain access to the American diet, to American affluence. You work hard, you prosper, you become wealthy, you're able to get better food and feed your children better. And one of the things Franz Boas notices is you have short immigrants, but the second generation are taller. They're receiving the American diet, lots of food, protein-heavy American diet. So the immigrants are quite short. Their kids are a little taller, and their children are much taller. So his argument in terms of changes in bodily form of descendants of immigrants is not that the immigrants are going to make Americans shorter. It's that America is going to make immigrants taller, okay? The short immigrants arrive, they work hard, they provide for their family, they build a better future for their children. And then you have, and I can't tell you how many pictures I've seen of this, of, some Italian family circa like 1970, 1980, where you've got a tiny little Italian grandma and a tiny little Italian grandpa, and their grandchildren are like 1.5 feet taller than they are, because they worked hard and made a better life for their children. And this is proven in 1911 by Franz Boas. Like I told you, it seems like common sense today, but that's exactly how powerful Franz Boas's arguments really were. And by the way, this is still true. This is still true. Franz Boas's arguments that he made back in 1911 were in fact recently verified, almost 100 years later, by a study called by Bogan and Ross, which they published in 2003. And what they did is they looked at a series of Guatemalan families. They were looking at these big Guatemalan families, and like half of the family would emigrate to the United States, and they accepted the amnesty in 1986. There was a big amnesty offer in 1986 by Ronald Reagan, in which they declared this ton of these whole bunch of immigrants to be legal. At any rate, what Bogan and Ross did is they studied two halves of the same Guatemalan family. Half of the family had stayed in Guatemala. The other half of the family had moved to the United States. And what La Princesa. Look at her up in the corner. And what they found was the chart right up above my head. That they studied the different statures of the girls in these families. And if you look at the chart right up above my head, the dark line with the black triangles, those are the girls of the half of the family that stayed in Guatemala. The line with the white triangle, with the white rectangles, those are the heights of the girls in the American half of the Guatemalan family. And you can see, the second and third generation, Guatemalans who are in the United States, these little Maya girls, on average, they're 10 to 15 centimeters taller than their Guatemalan cousins. Immigrants don't make Americans shorter. America makes immigrants taller. It was true in 1908. It was true in 1911. It's true in 2003. It is true in the 21st century. But probably one of the biggest things that Franz Boas did is not just publish books about bodily stature. It's not just publish, studies of the Kwaikutl ethnography. It's that Franz Boas proceeded to train a group of absolutely legendary students. And these students collectively become known as the Boazians. And we'll meet the Boazians in the next lecture. And I will see you there.